Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me here. I feel really, really honored to be in a room with so many bright people coming from so many different perspectives, understanding that it's a difficult place to present, given that. I told Susanna when she invited me, I said, you got to be kidding. Are you inviting me to this thing? Yeah, I'm just going into the field, okay? Everybody in this room, or at least 2/3 of you, seem as though you're coming out of 30 or 40 years of experience on, 20 or 30, sorry about that. Sorry. Of long-term research projects where you've had the fortune of being able to go back and go back and go back and take a look at what you're talking about. In my case, I've just come back from 30 years of living in Latin America, doing research and help others do research. But the paper that I'm going to present in this particular event has more to do with a reflection about how we're doing the current research that is coming out of the field as of last night, where it's a project, a CIFOR research project that I'll talk about in just a minute. My presentation is called The Invisible Map, Community Tenure Rights in the Forest. And what's prompted this particular research project and the paper as well, one other caveat, I also, not being a university academic, I don't have grad students, so I couldn't get my pictures up onto my, my presentation. Struggled with this for hours, and then I figured I'm in the wrong institution. I'm going to have to move from CIFOR into academia at some point. Anyway, as I was saying, the work that, the context that generated the interest in carrying out the work that we're going to be presenting is the recognition through a couple of publications that came out in over the last few years, in 2002, the first one, that there's been a tenure reform in the forest sector that we're calling a forest tenure reform. That's not well known, but it's really swept across particularly the southern forests in the world, transferring rights to local communities and peoples, going from public forest land to local tenure regimes, creating local tenure regimes. Between 1985 and 2000, there are the transference of these rights to locals in about somewhere around 250 million hectares of forest lands. The exact numbers are, as you know, very difficult to come up with because the FAO doesn't really collect the data quite well. So a lot of this has been additional work trying to check and recheck the official figures that are channeled to the FAO data. The lion's share of those transfers have taken place in Latin America, where nearly 150 million hectares were transferred to communities in only 4 countries, Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, and Peru. In smaller countries like Guatemala and Nicaragua, the process is taking place, but relatively speaking, they're much smaller numbers. More recently in Africa and Asia, the trends have been followed to the point that in 2000, we look at just the 30 largest countries with forest cover in the South, 22% of the forests are now in the hands of local communities. What we wanted to take a look at in setting in this project was, okay, what's really happening? These are global aggregate figures that don't really explain very much. Is this a movement? Well, is this a global phenomena? Is this a major historic moment when the state is going to begin to change its view of what the 80% of public lands in its hands is going to be in the future? So we started looking into it at a country level, country by country, and noticed more or less 3 basic trends that were behind the shift in tenure. These, by the way, are official data, so we suspect that really what's happening on the ground is significantly larger. One, some governments were recognizing community ownership, including territories owned by indigenous people, which I mentioned in the case of Latin America is the largest, is the bulk of land that's being recognized. And again, forest lands, okay, we're talking about forest lands in a very broad sense. Second, there's also a process of management responsibility of public forests being devolved to communities through changes in regulatory frameworks. Then the public logging concessions are also undergoing reform. And in some cases, there's room for increased community rights under private concession arrangements. But also, we're beginning to see emerge community forestry concessions. The initial trends, we thought, maybe something is really happening. There could be a new philosophy moving away from the notion of exclusion in forest lands or rendering everything either informal and or legal to formal statutory recognition of rights. And we wanted to try to get a handle on what does this mean? Where is it really going? What kinds of rights are being transferred? Okay. There we go. This just very quickly are some of the tables from the study, and I can give you the sites if you want to look at it. This study was done by an NGO named Forest Trends with Andy White and Alejandra Martin. And they went through, as I said, the top 30 forested countries, and these are tables that show the information for 24. What's most important here is the division under public and private, the way it's called, who's administering the land? The government? If it's reserved for community indigenous groups to administer while still formally classified as public lands, or under private, you can have individual private or community indigenous private as well, which means the title is actually being given to a community or collective organization. I want to pick up on those categories because the summary of this is in the large countries, and actually the case studies where we're working are in smaller countries as well, for reasons I'll explain in a minute. But you have a significant transference of millions of hectares. In this case, Bolivia being one of the most interesting, Brazil. If we go back and look at Russia, we weren't quite clear how to classify Russia. Is that the southern forests? Northern forests? Because, as you know, is it the third world, the second world? I mean, we decided to leave it out. It was just easier. And I think also we had no intention of trying to do some of the work there. But anyway, this just very briefly, what's where I'm bringing the reflections from is the attempt to implement this project and a series of methodological reflections that make it very difficult to get it off the ground. We started out with an overall, very simplified research objective, which then is broken down into a whole series of complex relationships. What is the impact of these tenure reforms on local livelihoods, well-being, and forests? This research is set up in 10 countries and 30 sites. In Latin America, which is Brazil, Pará. It's actually in Puerto de Mos, in Pará, which is very close to the area that you're presenting on today. Bolivia, Nicaragua, Guatemala. And in Africa, Cameroon, Burkina Faso, and Ghana. In Asia, it's Nepal and the Philippines. And in India, it's really reduced to a doctoral student who's finishing up some research. And in Laos, we found that we didn't have any national counterparts to work with, so it's more a training program than anything else at this point. But what I want to talk about are the initial steps. Getting this project rolling, we had to figure out, okay, what do we mean about a tenure reform? What tenure rights are recognized, adjudicated, or transferred to whom? How can you capture and measure and interpret this? So we found that we had to begin to look at what are some of the other, what are really our interests that separate us out from the other efforts that have been undertaken. When I say other efforts that have been undertaken, I make reference to participatory community land use mapping and the literature on statutory recognition of customary tenure forms. Those were the sort of the two avenues that we began to look into at first. But we wanted to make it clear, and this is also for Susanna too, we were trying to understand the institutional realm, okay, in the forest landscape. That our interest is the dimension of local knowledge and the systems of rights that organize the rules for resource use, particularly as they shape the land and natural resource claims for demarcation and legal titling. Okay, so we're honing in on the process of legal titling here. But we also wanted to see how that in and of itself was shaping the nature of the larger forest tenure reform, meaning the constellation of relationships between the state, or the many faces of the state, the local organizations that are receiving the rights, donors, private sector, and other actors. Our hope was that by looking at this, looking at the nature of the rights that are actually being transferred and who they're being transferred to, we'd be able to build on the institutions as a basis, not only for titling, but for increasing the internal capacity to adapt to the constant, ongoing interface with the state. This is very quick. We went through, we identified countries where there were important reforms that had just occurred, but also where there were political opportunities to deepen the reforms. That means we didn't go into highly conflictual areas, some of the countries that you've mentioned and the sites you've mentioned, but we did go into areas that had just come out of conflict, like in the case of Guatemala in the post-war period. We did literature reviews globally and then for each region, which was a nightmare because when you start getting into tenure, you're getting into colonial history, you're getting into colonial systems, Napoleonic law versus common law, where terminology was absolutely ghastly to be able to deal with. This is a project that's attempting to synthesize across the 3 regions and try to talk to each other. So we got stuck for several months just in that alone. And finally came up with a lexicon around the basic concepts that allowed us to talk to each other so we know what we would be looking at and trying to compare. We're not out of the woods yet on that, as we're getting I mentioned that things are just starting to come in over the last week. But I'd say that for the purposes of this paper and the exercise of trying to map tenure rights, we were particularly excited about what we found with Liz Wiley, Daniel Fitzpatrick, and Ben Cousins in Africa because of the wealth of experience and reflection in Africa about the interface between statutory rights and customary, and a lack of that in the case of Latin America. So here we have the lion's share of the tenure reform taking place in Latin America with a paucity of literature about how to deal with it, and Africa is really where we need to look to, as far as we can tell. So we went in search of a participatory method of mapping tenure. I say participatory too because obviously if you're trying to get involved not only in land use maps, but the institutions that dictate how land is being used, it has to be participatory. And the donors also said it had to be. Okay, so there were 2 propelling reasons. We wanted to say, how can we capture, measure, and analyze on the ground the tenure rights? The look into participatory mapping and understanding system of tenure rights led us to the body of work that is now maturing in a very interesting way. And I realize I'm sitting in a room with some of the leaders of this. I had no idea we were going to meet, but to participatory land use mapping. Most of this literature is gray literature and electronic literature still. It's barely making its way into scholarly journals and academic reflection. But it's quite fascinating to see some of the early reflection, and we draw on that in our work. After going through many, many websites, looking at a number of different tools, seeing project write-ups, donor reports, and like I said, the little reflection that actually exists out there in a systematic way, we came up with our own conclusions, okay? I'm ready. I'm sure you'll be the first one to stand up. But anyway, we said the good news is that the supportive community, the participatory land use mapping is working in support of community forest land claims. They give communities a common spatial framework, a map that strengthens their understanding of how physical, cultural, social, and economic factors interact. They're used for a wide number of purposes. Most technically assisted mapping projects are used to produce land use maps that are then the basis for establishing external boundaries or perimeters and deployed as an integral part of the legal process for acquiring land rights or tenure mapping. Like I said, there are many other uses, but this is the one we were most interested in. We felt that also, I'm going to call it PLUM, okay? Participatory Land Use Mapping, PLUM. PLUM bridged an incredibly important gap between the state and local claimants. making huge progress in presenting or disputing land claims based on de facto and customary and ancestral rights. I think it's coming mostly from the fact of the GIS. The GIS and the capacity to relate technologically from the field to the state was an incredible jump, and certainly has made enormous progress. There are numerous endeavors now that have been organizing networks for learning and training on this and expanding the methods. I would say, from looking over the literature, that the interface between GIS and local knowledge is where the greatest effort has been put. And it's absolutely fascinating, the kinds of things that have been developed, particularly in the Cameroon today, where I think it's Forest Peoples Project has developed mapping systems where local communities themselves can not just click the GIS, the GPS, but also they have a coded series of figures that they can say what the land. Some of you are very, very familiar with this. It's nothing new, but for us it was helpful to put it together. We found 4 major reasons that we could group things under. One is the boundary itself, the creation of the boundary itself, the overlapping resources, users, and rights, fluidity, and then who should hold the rights. I want to just make a quick comment on the fact that when we're talking about forest reforms, forest tenure reforms, we have a whole other paper on this, but we're trying to say that there's it's a distinct phenomena than land or agrarian reforms. Oh my goodness. Okay, so one reason, we're not talking about access to land, but access to resources, and there are multiple users of these resources. Multiple users and multiple existing resources. 2, the reform implies supposedly keeping the resource on the land. And 3, the state doesn't alienate the rights. Okay? Anyway, we're going to go quickly. Oops. On the boundary itself, and these are things that are well known, but we just sort of pulled them together. You have to delimit the perimeters, which is fixing the rights. Supposedly, this is a way to reduce conflict, and there's a whole series of literature around this as well, particularly picked up by DeSoto, who's promoting the privatization of individual rights. Let's see, how many? Okay, you end up creating false barriers across contiguous resources and spaces like pasture lands, Brazil nut tree groves, watersheds, lakes. That is sowing conflict, sowing tension and conflict. Also, once the lines are drawn, people who continue to use their resource patterns are criminalized very, very often. And it tends to erode the local governance structures for resource management, what little may be there, or the opportunity for actually creating governance structures out of conflict. The examples I'm not going to have too much time to look at, but this is a Brazil nut grove map made by one of the communities getting ready for the polygon to be overlaid and having a very serious problem. Brazil nut, like rubber trees, grows a very wide distribution through the forest, and people access them through senderos or pathways. So the ownership, the de facto rights to trees are based on long, sinuous paths that lead from one tree to another. And there's a huge resistance to having a polygon slapped onto these kinds of boundaries. And there's actually a very interesting process in Pando in Bolivia. Okay. So then we have the boundary is inappropriate. In the case of Honduras, the Mosquito Indians, it's a cultural resistance to the notion of a boundary. They use pana pana, which means I pass, you pass. Well, it took a year and a half for everybody to figure out in the Finsmos mosquito territory that they had to come up with a final boundary or they weren't going to get any land. So it was a huge, huge process, as many of you mappers know, of the GPS with a photo of who's there signing the document that says these are the rights. We don't care if they recognize them or not, but these have to be put down and understood by the communities if we're going to have a boundary that's being imposed on us. Okay, I'm going to have to go through not a time. This is timber versus Brazil nut, and it's a very interesting, another interesting case of where you have overlapping resources. Brazil nuts are pollinated by a series of beetles that come from the other surrounding trees. It can't be put in plantation. Fair trade and organic certification for Brazil nut production, which is booming in this part of both Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia, are running into the fact that logging can't take place there because they'll have their certification rescinded, yet timber rights are also being granted at the same time. Who should hold the rights? Oops, I went too fast. That's overlapping rights. Fluidity. You know these stories, okay? This is the seasonal fluidity, the problems with changes in drought years and reciprocal agreements between different land users who need to make sure that this tenure mapping does not exclude them from those rights. This will be incredibly important in is already incredibly important in adaptation to climate change. And we have to be very careful that these tenure reforms are not excluding people from these opportunities. Uh-oh, I'm not going to make it. What we did, basically, is take the conceptual framework of the bundle of rights, which has bundles of rights and right holders, we call it the tenure box, apply it to the sites where the changes are taking place and try to expand the categories to embrace the complexity for locals, meaning for the communities themselves, or the conflicted inhabitants of the areas that are going to be titled, the state, and then of course for researchers. They are usually the first ones to jump on this. The bundles of rights, what am I doing? Am I going the wrong way? Okay, yeah. Okay, the bundles of rights here is access, withdrawal, management, exclusion, and alienation. The holders, this is the classic system, the state, the collective, and the individual. You'll notice that in the collective rights, alienation rights are not transferred to the collective. But this is a very rigid and oversimplified framework that needs to be expanded, and that's exactly what we're doing. I won't go into the definitions because I think you can figure them out. But we definitely feel that it's important to expand them and describe them in the field. This is a moment of empirical testing, if you wish, and empirical development that can then come back up and feed a tool and even theoretical reflection later. In the rights holders, you need to expand the notion of holders as well, because the state, particularly in forest reforms, have many faces. It's not monolithic, and often the agencies in the field work at cross purposes. The collective, a completely heterogeneous and very changing institutional landscape as well, and even the family and the individual. The individual, is it a family? Is it nuclear? Is it extended? Is it a person? It gets very complicated. Time's up, okay. The applications are interesting. This is the Petén in Guatemala, where what we tried to do was put two moments together, the past and the current situation, to show where the rights had actually been moved. And what this points to is that the state is transferring a whole series of rights, except these are community concessions, okay, community forestry concessions. They're transferring a whole series of rights, except alienation rights, to the collective sphere. The individuals are also being held accountable to the collective sphere. And what the reform focuses on is creating, and this is so common, I know that those of you who work in the forested areas and think about institutions, you have to create a new institution that can be legally recognized, personaria jurídica, by the state in order to have the rights transferred. And this becomes a huge issue. I'll leave it for questions because I've already been told that time is up. This is an application in the case of Nicaragua. We couldn't do the arrows because it's really complex. So this is the before, and this is the after the application of the Communal Lands Law 445, which finally took the Mosquito Indigenous territories from autonomy, which was a little bit vague because it wasn't the law wasn't regulated, into actually the recognition of ancestral rights, titling, demarcation and titling and transfers of those rights. Our conclusions are that land use mapping has made important strides in identifying where rights are exercised. Okay? But the tenure box offers an important overlay of who holds what bundles of rights. The combination could help complete the picture of these reforms, giving conceptual guidelines for organizing the systems of rights, both for researchers to look at it and compare, for the state to see the invisible relations that overlay the physical maps, and for communities themselves as a tool to be able to negotiate who has what rights when. So we're basically proposing that some of us take the emphasis, not take away the emphasis on developing participatory land use mapping, the technology, the interface between the technology and the traditional knowledge, but try to develop the conceptual tool into a practical tool for capturing, organizing, and giving visibility to the underlying system of rights that organize resource use. Thank you very much.
What I'm going to propose here, given where we are in the schedule, is that we have 2 public questions, and then we will take a break at this point, a short break, about a 15-minute break, and reconvene here at about 11:05 and continue with the program, okay? So.
Deborah, thank you so much for your paper. It was almost about 4 or 5 papers in one.
Yeah, I know.
And to my mind, it was particularly important for what you've focused a lot of time on, which was the methodological aspects. You're absolutely right in saying that there's been very little theoretical work on participatory mapping. There's a lot of papers in the literature on participatory GIS, but they're mainly on practices rather than theory, and we've been trying to do some work at Leeds to extend that. I mean, what you didn't say, and which I think would probably come out of your work, is that participatory GIS is a reflective, and participatory mapping is a reflexive process, because when people actually engage with the GIS and they put things on the screen, they learn more about their local environment than they knew before, and therefore this is a kind of reflexive process. Now, you were talking about knowledge and institutions, and of course this actually syncs with what I was saying very early. You know, you've got this reflexivity between local knowledge and practices, and it's going backwards and forwards too. The concept of invisibility is incredibly important, and again not very much looked at the moment. Colin Price from University of Bangor has done some work on this in forest economics, but there's a lot of work still to be done. You've got invisible stakeholders who've got their own maps that are not put on the official maps, and as you said, they are invisible maps to the state, but they're not invisible to local people. And so really try and get some papers on your methodology, because I'm sure it will help an awful lot of people.
Thank you. Of course. Da, 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 da.
Well, I kind of felt like you put me on the spot, so I had to say something. As someone who's done a fair amount of mapping and mapping ancestral lands, I wanted to actually caution, it's more a comment, just to caution about the dangers of actually doing rights, going beyond land use mapping to rights mapping. We recently did a review of a mapping exercise done in northeast Cambodia, beginning to give people a sense of identifying boundaries that the government might recognize but had not yet recognized. And we looked in 3 communities. One where an NGO had been working continuously for 10-15 years, raising people's awareness of their rights, their responsibilities, the dangers that could be involved with land speculators. This is an area that is converting from swidden cultivation to commercial ag, the story we've been hearing throughout. And in 2 other villages where they did, actually it's called PLUP, Participatory Land Use Planning, right? You call it plum, they call it PLUP. But, and 2 other villages did not have this continual interaction with outsiders to raise their awareness of their rights. And one village was totally broken down village leadership, another one in the process. The one with the totally broken down leadership had now sold off 70% of the land, which they technically still did not yet own. So, and in the other village, they had not yet started to sell, but the divisions within the village, the opening up, the conflicts that will lead to selling are clearly, writings on the wall. So, as I've almost stepped away from mapping because I'm very, very scared of the implications of this mapping for people's rights.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I completely agree with you. And let me just say a couple of things. One, the experience in mapping has two or three or four sides to it. But the emphasis that we're putting on here is just as it took it took external mapping a long time to get to participatory, in the real true sense of participatory. But as far as I'm concerned, it's crucial, particularly on the side of the institutions, and it's up to them at the end of the day, whoever them is, and that's the hardest part. I mean, who should hold the rights is a very big issue, depending on if you have a nice, well-oiled, still functioning, evolving, customary institution, great. That's not usually the case. So it's difficult. But they need to be the ones to determine what gets visibility, when, to whom, and how. And it's been very interesting in the case of Guatemala with the community concessions, where you had basically a map war between the government and the concessions. This is going on all over Latin America with the indigenous and Forest Peoples, MAC Chapin and Forest Peoples Program, et cetera, where it's a war between who can present what in the way that's most compelling to gain the right or the recognition that's on the table, and who can interpret it. I think what we're trying to go out here is that the land use is a final dot on the map. It is cartography, okay? It is a perimeter. It's a dividing line. What we're asking for now in the forest reform, and it's actually really a very big challenge to the forestry sector, I think forestry, environment, and agriculture myself, is there has to be a way to go beyond that and recognize institutions in a way that can be flexible, right? So it's a part of the process in creating this tool, and we've gone into the field in how do you say torpe in Spanish, as sort of clumsily into the field, trying to figure out how to make this thing work locally and also come out with a product, and just gotten battered. I found out that it's actually interesting to the local people, interesting to the state, maybe for the wrong reasons. But at the end of the day, it should be the local community, folks who have a shared interest in a common resource. That's kind of our bottom line definition. What to make visible when.
Just directly on that point, I fully appreciate the challenges and complexities of what you're trying to do. My own experience working in parts of West Africa, Ghana, and also from some of the literature on Burkina Faso, is, first of all, that this question of who is the community is an extremely complex one that has to be looked into in the course of these kinds of right identification processes, because often they are anything but democratic. Secondly, I wonder how far one can go in inferring rights from land use, which it seems to me is the kind of direction that's involved in using GIS mapping as a basis for trying to determine boundaries around rights. Because often land uses are themselves strategies for trying to alter or strengthen land rights, planting trees in order to kind of stabilize and enhance one's rights. And it's interesting that I've run across examples, again, from both Ghana, Burkina Faso, Benin, in which local initiatives around issues of trying to record land rights take the form not so much of engaging in mapping exercises, but rather beginning to create locally generated records of land transactions that chart some of the changes and get at some of the kind of fluidity that you're interested in from the point of view of practice.
Wow, that's very, very helpful. I think what I'm saying, I just didn't want to be too bold in saying it, is that we want to not go from land use mapping as our point of departure, but get there in different moments and different times. By focusing on the institutions and the organizations, you get away from looking at the spatial rendition of the cognitive information as the last word, because it is incredibly changing. One clear example, the Oaxacan indigenous of the Sierra Norte, who are the forest communities of Mexico, who migrate to the United States and form the Club de Oaxaqueños de Los Angeles, which is the Los Angeles branch of the Oaxacan community forestry dwellers, by village, send back their remittances, and I call them conditioned remittances. They send them back because this is a form of dues, right, collective dues or tequio. They send them back conditioned saying, I want this put on the collective land and I want trees left untouched. Okay? They begin to dictate land use through the remittances while they're a transnational, international community. So I mean, it's incredibly fluid. Thanks.
Thanks so much. We'll reconvene in about 15 minutes.